Good evening and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program with Greater Boston PFLAG. My name is Deborah Hoffman and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks so much for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. We have two speakers tonight. Together, they'll speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and after both of their talks, they'll field questions. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube. Feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them at the end of the presentation. Rella Tosca identifies as queer and gender non-binary and is a program manager with Greater Boston PFLAG. They are a facilitator and social justice educator who loves working with people to better understand how to be allies to the LGBTQ+ community. And Deb Fitzgerald is a 60-year-old cisgender mom of an only child who identifies as male and is gay. She found PFLAG as her son started transitioning and has found support and guidance in her journey to be the best ally for her son and the LGBTQ+ community. Over to you, Rel and Deb, and remember to unmute.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It is so wonderful to be here with you all. As Deborah mentioned, my name is Rel. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a program manager with Greater Boston PFLAG. I'm going to start sharing my screen in just a second, but I'd love for Deb to also say hello and introduce herself as well.
Hi, everybody. My name is Deb. I use she, her pronouns. And as Deborah said, I am a mom of a trans son who is also gay. So I'm really happy to be here and hope that my story will just help in educating and supporting all the people who are out there identifying LGBTQ+. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Deb. So I am just going to share my screen in present mode. I want to welcome you all to tonight's event, and thank you, Deborah, for organizing. Really appreciate being in the space tonight. So I am going to talk a little bit to you all tonight about how to think about creating safer communities, more welcoming, accepting, affirming communities for LGBTQ+ people. Before I do that, I want to give a little bit of a brief overview of what PFLAG is, because oftentimes people want to know a little bit more about the organization. So PFLAG is actually a national organization with chapters all over the country. Deb and I are here tonight from the Greater Boston PFLAG chapter. And what we do is we work to really foster LGBTQ+ inclusive families, workplaces, and communities. We are looking to make LGBTQ+ people feel welcome, included, affirmed, and just generally like feeling safer in the places where they live and work and play and with their families. And we do that through three kind of main buckets. So the first is through support. Right now, Greater Boston PFLAG has 16 different support groups that are meeting virtually. And these support groups are for parents, caregivers, loved ones, really anyone who is looking to gain support for themselves so that they can better support the LGBTQ+ people in their lives. We also offer one-to-one support groups. So for folks who might not be ready for that larger group setting, we pair families and caregivers or anyone up with another person or family who might be in a similar situation, have people in their lives with similar identities to get that one-to-one support as well. The next bucket is education. So that is where I come in as a program manager. I go into schools, corporations, nonprofits, community groups, houses of worship, any type of organization that wants to get that education to create safer, more inclusive LGBTQ+ spaces and communities. And then lastly, we do advocacy work. So we partner with other organizations and coalitions, both throughout the state of Massachusetts as well as nationally, to make sure that the laws and policies that are being created are supportive and affirming of LGBTQ+ people and families. So that's a little bit about us. I'm going to go over a few objectives. The first is to really get an understanding of some background information to provide context. Why are we all here? What is the importance of Pride Month? And why do we want to be thinking about LGBTQ plus communities? We'll learn some correct and up-to-date LGBTQ plus language and terminology. We're going to cover a couple of distinct differences between gender identity, sex assigned at birth, gender expression, and sexual orientation. We'll talk a little bit about ways that you can be a better ally to LGBTQ plus folks, as well as what allyship can look like. And then we're going to hear from Deb. Deb is going to share her story and her journey as a parent, which I am super excited for. I like to go over a couple of quick training guidelines. I know that you all are viewing this through YouTube and not necessarily engaging with us via Zoom, but we do still want this to be considered a safe and/or brave space, because safety is sort of a relative thing. What might feel safe to one person doesn't necessarily feel safe to other folks. So we think about this in the context of a brave space. And the way that that might work for you all in the audience is to really be thinking about what kinds of questions you want to ask. As Deborah mentioned, you can put your questions into the chat at any time throughout the presentation. We love to hear from you and bring that sense of curiosity, right? This is an educational opportunity, an educational space. And then assuming good intents. We'll assume, your best intents in the questions that you're asking. And Deb and I would want you to assume the best intent for us as well. For me as a facilitator, just bringing in the most relevant and up-to-date information that I can, while holding, the experiences of LGBTQ plus people, and also the folks who are allies. And then lastly, just kind of noticing and exploring your own levels of awareness or comfort and discomfort with the content. I know that oftentimes learning new terminology about the LGBTQ plus community can be new. So just sort of sitting with how this lands for you, and how that might inform some of the questions that you're going to be asking tonight. So to jump into some of this background information, like I said, I like to kind of set the stage for what are we even thinking about? What does LGBTQ plus even stand for? So when we're thinking about this acronym, it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans or transgender, queer, and then we have the plus sign. So at Greater Boston PFLAG, we include the plus to really incorporate and capture the vast number of gender identities and sexual orientations that can exist. There are so many different ways that folks can identify. And the LGBTQ does cover a large chunk of folks, but there are also many other ways that people can identify. And we'll get into some of those terms as we move through the presentation. I like to use this slide as an example of thinking about LGBTQ plus people who exist, thinking about the generational shift. So this was a poll that actually was done in 2016. So even the numbers between then and now are probably even a bit different, but I think it really highlights the fact that in 2016, when this poll was taken, only 7% of folks in the boomer generation identified as LGBTQ, as compared to 20% of millennials. Now, does this mean that being queer or being LGBTQ is just a phase? It's just a thing about young people? No, definitely not. What we're seeing is that there's just much more visibility. There's more language to talk about LGBTQ plus identities, more acceptance in some places for sure. And so there's more and more young people and folks who feel like they can identify as LGBTQ or are able to come out in spaces that they might not have previously been able to. And when we're thinking about gender and sexual orientation, we also really need to keep in mind this idea of intersectionality, that we can't just talk about race. We just can't talk about sexual orientation and gender without thinking about race, disability, nationality, immigration status, socioeconomic class, and all of these other really important identities that come together and make people who they are and change how they might be seen in the world or perceived, and also change their experience with their day-to-day interactions. So thinking about those other identities is also a very important piece of thinking about the LGBTQ+ community. So to jump into the basics, I am going to get into some of the kind of language and terminology that I think can really help set the stage for creating a shared language and a shared framework for talking about these really important issues and really important topics. So when we think about LGBTQ+ identities, the first place I like to start is thinking about the difference between binaries and spectrums. So a binary is something that you might think of as having only two options. There's really only maybe two ways to look at something or two ways to think of something. So some common binaries that we might think about are the idea of either you are a boy or a girl, or you are young or old, or you are straight or gay. But what we know is that within the LGBTQ+ community, those binaries oftentimes don't really do a lot of good in helping people explain and explore their identity. So we can really learn a lot from thinking about spectrums. So spectrums are things that have lots of options, right? There are no boundaries, there's no boxes. We're not trying to put people into boxes with neat little bows that describe them or their identities. There are many ways to identify, and people can fall on different ends of various spectrums. So I like to think about the idea of just age, right? So the young and old binary can really be described more as a spectrum, right? So people are born, they are a baby, they go through infancy, then we have kids and teens, young adults, middle-aged people, aging folks. There's infinite in-betweens, and those boundaries are kind of blurry. And gender and sexuality really kind of are the same, right? There's lots of different ways that people can be attracted to other folks. There's lots of different ways that people can identify themselves. And so there are lots of possibilities when we think about LGBTQ+ people. The first kind of main concept here, or term, is sex assigned at birth. So this is when a baby is born, and a doctor or a midwife might look at the baby, and based on their primary sex characteristics, their external anatomy, they will be assigned either male or female at birth. This is often thought of as a binary, right? That you can either be male or you can be female. But when we look at intersex identities, we can see even from birth, right? Even from this concept of sex assigned at birth, that there are variations. There are normal variations in bodies. So roughly 2% of the population is born as intersex. So that means that their sex traits fall outside of those typical conceptions of what we might think of as male or female. So after sex assigned at birth, the next term is gender identity. So gender is a person's own internal understanding of themselves as either a man or a woman, or both or neither. And so for folks who are born and they are assigned male at birth, and they continue to identify as male throughout their lives, they would be considered a cisgender man. And then for folks who might be assigned female at birth and continue to identify as female or as a woman throughout their lives, they would be considered cisgender. But then for folks who are born and their gender identity does not align with their sex assigned at birth, those folks are typically considered transgender. And when we're thinking about gender, we can also kind of look at that as different identity umbrellas. So for cisgender folks, there's that cis umbrella. We have cis women, cis men. And then the trans umbrella is a kind of way to describe multiple people. Transgender identities are very diverse. There is no one way to be transgender. Some folks identify as trans women, some folks identify as trans men, and some people have a gender identity that kind of falls outside of that male-female binary. So those folks could be considered non-binary. And some of those identities that fall within that umbrella category are gender queer, gender fluid, bigender, agender. There's so many different ways that non-binary people can identify. And I'm not going to go over each and every one of these terms because they can mean different things to different people. One of the best ways to be an ally to the LGBTQ plus people and to trans and non-binary folks is to not make assumptions about how they identify, and also to let people describe themselves in the ways that feel best for them. So, one thing you can do if a person shares with you that they identify as non-binary, you might ask, what does that mean to you? Or what are some identities that you identify with? If you have that kind of relationship with that person, and if that feels right in that particular setting. A little bit more about non-binary identities. Again, non-binary folks don't identify strictly as male or female. They might identify as something kind of in between, or not with any particular identity at all. These are just a few examples of some folks: Elliot Page, Jonathan Van Ness, and John Sneezy, who is in the middle. He identifies as a two-spirit, Indigenous Native person. Next term I wanted to talk about is gender expression. So if we think about gender identity as how people feel about themselves internally, gender expression is how people present or express their gender externally. So this can look like, the way that we wear our hair, whether we paint our nails, the type of clothing we choose, whether we want to dress in a more traditionally masculine way or a traditionally feminine way, right? We can all, I'm sure, come up with many types of things that we might categorize as male or female or masculine or feminine. And gender expression is important because just similar to gender identity, everybody has some type of gender expression. This isn't just a term that is exclusive to the LGBTQ plus population. And oftentimes gender expression kind of forces people into pretty strict boxes of how they feel like they can be in the world, or what they can wear, or how they can be. And so one thing I really like to share is that, people get to be free to present in ways that make them feel good. And some folks might identify as gender expansive. So this is another one of those kind of umbrella terms used for people that kind of stray from what we might think of as those commonly held ideas of what gender is and who gets to wear certain colors or wear certain types of clothes. This identity and or expression that is expansive and kind of breaks down those boundaries, breaks down what we might typically think of as male or female or masculine and feminine. This gender expansive sometimes is also referred to as gender nonconforming. Sometimes those terms get used interchangeably, although I think that that nonconforming is, useful for some people, and also gender expansive is a term that I'm hearing a lot more for people to identify with. Now, one important aspect of all of this is to really know that it's important to not make assumptions about people based on what you're seeing, right? Just because you know a person's pronouns, or you might know the sex that they were assigned at birth, doesn't necessarily mean that you actually know how that person identifies internally, what their gender identity is, and how they see themselves. And so it's important to really realize that just because you're perceiving someone one way doesn't mean that that's actually how they want to be perceived. So really keeping in mind to check your assumptions when you're thinking about other people and what pronouns they might use or how they might identify, because you really can never know. The next term is sexual orientation, and this refers to the desires and sexual feelings that one person can experience towards others. Some folks might be considered straight, so men that are attracted to women, or women that are attracted to men. And again, that kind of is that kind of is in that more binary sense of the way that sexual orientation plays out. But in the spectrum of LGBTQ plus people, there are many other ways of identifying, right? Folks, similar to the way that I didn't want to kind of go over each and every term for folks that might identify as non-binary, it's kind of the same thing for folks who might identify as gay or queer or lesbian or bisexual, pansexual. These terms can mean different things to different people. If you have specific questions about any of the words you see on the screen here, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'd be happy to kind of go over them later on in the presentation. These are just some of the examples of folks within that LGBTQ LGBTQ spectrum. A lot of folks want to know a little bit more about the word queer. Can you use the word queer? Queer does have a long history of being used negatively as a slur, but recently it's been reclaimed by folks to be used as a positive, powerful word that holds a lot of meaning. I know for me, I identify as queer, and it's a word that means a lot to me, and it allows me to not have to sort of pin down any one of those words or terms that that might like limit who I get to be and how I get to show up and express myself, both with my gender and my sexual orientation, but also because of the folks that I might be attracted to, right? Queer is another umbrella term that that can mean different things to different people, and really often kind of refers to ways of being in the world that that are different, that aren't kind of held to those maybe more heteronormative ideas of how we think about being. It's a word to use with caution if you don't hold that identity yourself. And again, that reclamation of the word queer can be more common in younger folks or in certain geographical areas. So it's not necessarily a term or a word that is used by everyone. So it is a word to kind of use with caution. And if you know that someone identifies as queer, it's typically an okay word for you to use. Let me think about this idea of questioning. So, you know, many people go through different processes of discovery and exploration of their identity. This can be true for their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their gender expression, or a combination of all of these things. And questioning is really leaving that space for every single person to determine and decide for themselves what feels right and what feels good for how they want to identify. The other thing about questioning is that it can happen in multiple times in a person's life. It's not just something that young people experience. It's a part of human development that can really occur at any age and at any juncture in a person's life. So leaving that space for folks to kind of question, go through that process of questioning or exploration and figuring out who they are and who a person wants to be. But I get into pronouns a little bit more. Pronouns are, you know, things that many people use, oftentimes in the English language. If a person identifies as a woman or as female, we might use the pronoun set she, her, hers. If a person identifies as a male or as a man, we might use he, him, his. And then for folks who identify as non-binary or they don't want to be, you know, tightly held to one of those sets of pronouns, they might use the pronoun set they, them, theirs. And then at the bottom, you see that orange set of pronouns, sie, here, hers. That's also another neo or new set of pronouns that some folks use. There's also a lot of other neo or different new pronouns that folks can use. And again, this is up to each individual person to decide for themselves what pronoun sets feel right and fit. Some folks use a combination of pronouns, maybe he, they, or she, they. And people's pronouns can change, you know, whenever they feel is it right for them, right? So it's not a stagnant thing. It's not necessarily something that, you know, a person might use she, her pronouns at one stage in their life, and then use they, them, theirs at another stage, right? That they can change. There's fluidity in pronouns. The singular they as a pronoun is typically the most commonly used non-binary pronoun. And I love to share a little bit more about they, them pronouns because they are becoming much more commonly used. Similar to the word queer, language is always changing and evolving, right? So just because you may have been told at one point in your schooling that they, them pronoun, or that they was only, you know, used to could be referred to multiple people. It's recognized now in the dictionary as a totally acceptable, popular, and correct way to refer to one singular person. And we're already kind of using they as a pronoun as a way to refer to someone when we don't know the gender, right? So even in this image here, we have this picture of a person on a tightrope with the umbrella, and you might say, what are they doing up there, right? Because just by looking at this, I can't tell the gender of that person. So we're doing this all the time in our everyday language. And, you know, when we think about the evolution of language, you know, in the English language, especially, you know, I think about in the United States, we're using different words and speaking differently than we did, you know, even, you know, just 100 years ago, 50 years ago, right? Like that language is always changing and evolving. And how to be inclusive with pronouns. So you can share your own. I know a lot of folks, especially on Zoom, like to put their pronouns next to their name as a way to be a good ally, as a way to open up space for other people to share their pronouns. If you don't know somebody's pronoun, it's okay to ask. Of course, some folks might not want to share their pronouns, and that is absolutely okay as well. It's really important to create that space for people to open up and share their pronouns if that's what they want, if that will make them feel more safe and affirmed. But of course, it's never okay to force anyone to share their pronouns, especially for folks who might be going through you know, a period of questioning, right? They're not sure what pronouns feel good for them yet. But making that space can be really, really important. If you make a mistake, if you misgender someone, if you use the wrong pronoun, the best thing to do is just to correct yourself and move on. It's good to not put that attention, you know, back on you, and then to have the person who you misgendered have to, you know, over apologize for you and the mistake that you made, right? So just correcting yourself and moving on is the best course of action there. And then, you know, like I said, respecting people's boundaries if they do or don't want to share their pronouns, and creating a culture of accountability, finding a friend to practice they, them pronouns with, if it's something that you're having a hard time getting. That's one way to really kind of think about that. And then, you know, correcting other folks if they do make a mistake. That's that culture of accountability, and really reminding people how people want to be referred to. So I'm going to get into a little bit more around allyship and some action steps that you all can take. And then we're going to hear from Deb. So allyship 101. What does it mean to be an ally? I think that allyship for me really is an action. It's something that you do. It's something that you show, not just claiming the identity of an ally. So one of the best things you can do as an ally is to ask the LGBTQ plus folks in your life how they want to be supported. Allyship is not a one size fits all thing. What I might want from allies could be different from, you know, another person who might hold similar identities to me, right? So asking the folks in your life how to support them is an awesome, awesome first step. Sending those signals that you are a safe person. At the bottom of the screen here, you see an ally pin. Sometimes just those signals can go a really long way. The kind of showing of like rainbow flags, or putting your pronouns in your email signature, putting your pronouns in your Zoom account. Those are all really awesome ways to start to send those signals that you understand and that you know that that people can really kind of think about you as a trusted person. Showing up for the LGBTQ plus community, this can sometimes be easier in the month of June because it's Pride Month. There's lots of different events that you can show up to, lots of different educational opportunities, but really thinking about ways that you can show up for the LGBTQ plus community outside of June, outside of the 1 month a year where LGBTQ plus people are celebrated. How can you extend that throughout the year? And then accepting that you can support someone without fully understanding them. Just showing up and showing that you care and love someone without fully understanding their identity is also completely okay. We don't need to understand every aspect of a person. And then continuing that education. Oftentimes, LGBTQ plus people do have to shoulder a little bit more of the burden to do that educating and to teach people in their lives what they want, what they need, what pronouns are. So doing that education yourself, and then also educating the other people in your lives who might need that information as well, can be a really awesome step for allies. When you do come across discrimination, misgendering, homophobia, transphobia, these things that are very real and have very real impacts on LGBTQ plus people, being able to intervene and stop it, name that behavior. And then if it's you, claiming it, right? Like it's common for people to make mistakes. It definitely happens. And being able to own that and learn from it and do better the next time, right? Accepting and learning from mistakes can be a really good way to show people that that you're committed to doing better, right? So what can you do now? Educating yourself, continuing to check out resources, getting curious about LGBTQ plus inclusive curriculum in schools, whose voices are being centered, thinking about, your library, right? Waltham Public Library, what kind of books are available in the library for you and for other folks in the community to have access to. Voting and researching candidates and policies. There's many different laws that are being pushed through legislation in different states right now that are incredibly important to learn more about, that have real impacts on transgender and non-binary youth, specifically around sports and healthcare. So doing that research and really becoming familiar with what's happening in the country, what's happening in your particular state, and then doing that extra work to contact your legislators, contact your senators, contact those folks who are in positions of power to really make a big difference. I named a few more of these, but updating your email signature and your social media to share your pronouns, practicing those they, them pronouns or other pronouns with a friend, and then finding LGBTQ plus organizations to support, whether that's financially or with your time and other things that you can be doing. So those are just a few examples, and really thinking about your kind of sphere of influence, right? That's where this image comes in. Who can you have influence over yourself, being kind of that first person, then moving out to your family, your friends, the close people in your life, and then in the communities that you're a part of, whether that's work or school, the library, other community groups like that. So just kind of focusing in on those aspects as next steps. So that is what I have. I'm sure there's lots of questions coming in. I'm really excited to get to your questions. But I also want to turn the mic over to Deb. Deb, we are so grateful for you to be here tonight. I am actually going to stop sharing my screen so we can see you a little bit larger. And whenever you're ready, please take it away. We're thrilled to hear your story.
Thank you, Rel, and thank you for everything that you just shared. I continue to learn myself every time I hear, the outline that PFLAG presents. So, hi, my name is Deb. As I said, I have a son who's transgender and he is gay. My hope tonight is that as you listen to my story, it's going to put a face on and a light, but a human face on the experience of having a child who is in the LGBTQ community. I like to tell people I'm out west of Boston. I live in a town that's a little more rural next to Hopkinton. And so, I mean, I have a pretty, I don't know, a pretty good life, you know, just moving along, nothing out of the ordinary kind of life, a basic ordinary life. And so my son in 8th grade, he was, well, I'll start with, he was identified female at birth. And we went through childhood like any other family, any other, you know, kid's childhood, all of the regular stuff. In 8th grade, he left a note for his dad and I as he left for school. And he asked us not to open it till he was gone. In the note, he articulated that he knew he was not a girl. He was a boy and had, you know, been kind of researching it and looking into it and reading things and identifying with the fact that he knew he was in the wrong body. You know, at the initial response from his dad and I was one of, you know, shock. You just, you know, this is news that if you're not at all prepared, you don't, for me, I'll share, I just didn't understand it enough to, you know, right in the beginning say, okay, that's fine. But what I did know and what my reaction to this news was, is that I knew it was going to put my child at risk of being possibly harmed and discriminated against. And I just knew that now things were going to be different for him. And for me as a mom, my fear went into overdrive because we all want to know that our kids are safe, that our kids are accepted, that they're loved in the world outside of home. And they won't come across people that are going to hurt them. That was my motivation right out of the gate. I got to learn as much as I can. So, you know, he asked that we not use his name given at birth, and that was hard. You know, the whole process is hard, but I continued to remind myself when I could, you know, it's hard for you, yes, as mom, but imagine what it's like for him. So with that, I just went to work at teaching myself and educating myself, like Rel said, you know, as best as I could so that I could be an ally for my son. That was fine. And I was doing this kind of work, but the actual transition, just to give you some, you know, some eyes into what that might look like, he had an accepting mom. His dad, you know, kept thinking it was a phase, which after researching enough, I grew to understand that this is, if a child is coming forward about their gender identity, you need to listen, and there's a really good chance that it's not a phase, that they're asking for your help, and that any kind of dismissing of it or rejection of it will end up significantly hurting that child. And, you know, statistics are pretty grim for those LGBTQ kids, especially trans kids who are in a family that don't accept them. So again, I was right away on board to just learn as much as I could. At some point in my journey, I just wanted to help my son so much that I was kind of starting to lead things. And, you know, I use the analogy of getting on the bus and getting behind the wheel and, you know, come on, we'll do this together. And him saying, Mom, it's not your journey. It's my journey. So finding my way as a parent between, you know, having to be an advocate, speaking for my son because he's not 18, speaking and helping him navigate in society where he was really fearful. I mean, so the gender, as Rel had talked about, is how you identify in your gender. It has nothing to do with sexuality. It's how you're identifying. I've heard it said in some of my support groups that imagine waking up one morning with an appendage somewhere that you don't know where, you can't identify with it. It's part of your body, but it is not what you see as part of your body. It's very, very traumatic. And so I learned about gender dysphoria. And the gender dysphoria, we don't want to diagnose and put things in this category of medically, you're in a category of a diagnosis. But the gender dysphoria is a symptom of not being in the body that you feel you are. That symptomatically looks like extreme anxiety, panic attacks. I've never seen anything like it. Withdrawal, just withdrawing into your own self. The other term, hostility. A lot of hostility. Typically, I came to learn on the person who's there supporting you the most, because it's not safe to be hostile towards people who you already think might be hostile towards you. I was the safe person, so a lot of hostility. Suicide ideation, self-harm, all of the things we don't want to see our kids have to go through. My son was experiencing it. It took time and patience and years. So from 8th grade, he started transitioning, but it was little by slow at his speed. He didn't want to come out publicly. He was making small changes, just haircut, clothing, and that kind of thing outwardly. But he still wasn't able to articulate and feel safe to say, I'm a transgender male out into the world, because again, the fear was too great. So that was, that's 6 years of living kind of in secrecy, trying to be the person you're intended to be, and going out into the world and experiencing, in a lot of cases, being misgendered, being looked at in ways that don't feel good. It's being there as a parent meant for me overcoming my own fears in order to be there for my son and support him the best way I could, and to let him not interfere too much so that he could intentionally stay on his journey. We sought medical advice, and thank God we live in an area in Boston where there are wonderful resources. We found fantastic mental health support and medical support. And my son did transition. He had what's called top surgery, which basically is masculinization of the chest. And he's had a full hysterectomy so that he does not have to deal with the female, the physiological aspects of female organs in one's body. So that's one thing. Some of these things might sound shocking to some people, but again, if you're living in the wrong body, these types of hormone replacement therapy, all of these things that are being offered by the medical community are there really in order to save a person's life, because they're there to reaffirm and affirm what and who they need to be. So I often say these services weren't something that it was just optional. These were going to save my son's life. These people who we ended up finding and who, supported my son during transition at all different levels, they were saving his life every day. And I was learning from them. So it was a long road and a lot of isolation and a lot of just standing by and trying to trust my son to make the journey, but also be there protecting, because as I said in the beginning, when you find, when your child comes to you and tells you that they're transgender, fear is one of the main things I think we all have to face as parents. Fear that our child is going to be, outside of the norm, discriminated, harmed, and hurt. I know all I need to do is listen to the news. Things do happen, and bad things happen to people in the LGBTQ community. Once my son transitioned and became the man that he needed to become, to the degree that he's still transitioning, every day of his life, but more presenting. He came out publicly on social media to his small group. And that was beautiful, because there was a lifting of just a lot of, that secrecy and heaviness that you live with in your life. And then it was about a year later that he was able to start identifying in his sexuality, and he is a gay young man. And but that couldn't happen for him. Sometimes it happens before the transgender, but in our story, it was something that happened after he made the transition. So I'm happy to say my son is just finished his first year of college. He's at Emerson, which is a very welcoming school. He's made friends in the LGBTQ community. He's thriving, he's got a job at Dunkin' Donuts. He's doing things that he was never really comfortable doing. And that's just presenting himself out in the world, just being a regular kid and a regular person. It's a 6-7 year journey. So, I'll kind of end with a quote that I just read because of Pride Month that I came across, and it's by a Pennsylvania State Representative, Malcolm Kenyatta. He himself is a gay man. And his quote is, "It's so difficult to be what you can't see." And when I read that, what I hear is, if we are not allowing the community to be seen as who they are because of they're fearful, then they can't reflect their own goodness and understand who they are. So this isolation perpetuates itself. For my son to be seen out in the world, it meant that he had to risk being harmed in some way, discriminated against, being rejected as a human being, just the basic rights that I take for granted as a cisgender woman in our society. He had to worry about that every day. So being seen to him was scary. And I believe that if our society is going to be, accepting, the visibility has to be there. And the visibility, we have to, in the visibility, we have to support and I guess, allow people to be who they are. Like Ro was saying, ask questions, be an ally. Don't be afraid if you make a mistake about something to just speak up and just move on, or say, sorry about that. Educate ourselves. Listen when people are talking. I mean, in the LGBT community, what I'm doing now is, in this small group I'm in, we talked about, instead of we as parents who are cisgender talking about our trans kids, how about we start to look at what's out there in movies and books? I mean, these young people are writing and they're showing up in movies and other kind of media outlets. Listen to their stories. Listen to what they're trying to tell us. How can I support you? Just to be seen. We all, as humans, want to be seen, and really, that's all my son is asking for. It's not complicated. He's asking to be seen and to be able to have any rights that anybody else does. To be able to walk down the street and feel safe. to get on the T and take it from one stop to the other and be safe. And just to be the beautiful human being he is. So my story is that my story is here to hopefully have other people see that, I'm just a regular mom who worries about their kid being safe in the world. And then by being here today, I hope that you see my face and you hear my story. And when you see a kid out there and you can, you're not sure or whatever, they're in the LGBT community, they're presenting as such, just know that they're somebody's kid. They're somebody's little baby that grew up and is as lovable and deserving of love and support as any other kid. So I guess I'll end there. But thank you. Thanks everybody for listening.
And
thank you, Deb.
And thank you both, Deb, for that very heartfelt and honest story of your journey. And I'm so glad to hear your son is doing well. And Ralph, for that excellent 101 overview. We do have time for a couple of questions. And we have a couple comments, so I will read those to you. One viewer says, thank you so much for the intersectionality slide. So important. So that was appreciated. This is a question for Deb. Is there a particular moment that stands out to you, something you heard or read that was particularly powerful in helping you understand your son or how to support him? Sort of an aha moment.
Yeah, I don't know that there was an actual aha moment. And I think that's what makes the journey, sometimes it's not an easy journey. And it took me being persistent in just continuing to read. So I would read a book about a mom who had a child who came out as transgender. And I would get a little bit out of that, but maybe still not see myself in that story. And then it was on to the next, whether it was a book or an article. I really had to guide myself to resources. And, and I was little by little finding myself in other people's stories. So there wasn't for me any aha moment. It was a cumulative, really intentional journey. And that's, as a parent, I believe, we really have to be intentional about this, that if we're there for our kids, it's not going to be easy, but, the whatever I could learn, I knew was going to help my child, and help me feel supported. So, mine was, I think, more of a cumulative process. And it's been years. It still is, still learning.
Still a journey. Another comment for you, Deb. What a great and inspiring story. I think all of us who are parents hope that we could have the grace to be as supportive and understanding as you are with our children, whatever their identities. And another question for you, Deb. May I ask how the grandparents reacted or related?
Yeah, that's a great question. For our family, I am a bit older of a parent. So my mom had died when Jamie was 8. My dad had been gone for many years. On my husband's side, his Nana and Pa had also passed. So Brian and I, my husband, often talk about that, how that was one piece of this that we really didn't have to, I hate to say the word deal with, but it is that in our support group, Greater Boston PFLAG, that comes up a lot. And it can be, it can really be a difficult situation. I've heard some say that, my parents 90 and you know what? They see my child, we don't talk too much about it. Others who have come out and said it, I do have the experience of my aunt, my dear aunt, who died last year of Alzheimer's. And she was one of my closest family outside of my mother. Jamie would come, and my auntie knew Jamie as girl and the other name. And Jamie would come to visit with me as her Alzheimer's progressed. And I sometimes tell the story that it was in some ways this gift of, holding on. So, we hold on to identities. We want to see things the way we feel comfortable seeing them. In her progression of Alzheimer's, she would see him, and she would sometimes look maybe a little confused or perplexed, but then didn't skip a beat, and we just go right on to whatever the conversation was. So it was kind of opening up space, like, all right, this wasn't making her more confused. It was just an opening that was more organic, like, oh, all right, they're here. I don't need to remember their name, which is hard with Alzheimer's. I don't have to remember any of the things that we try so hard to hang on to and grasp at when we have our minds, right? So that's an interesting story that my aunt just kind of, it was just kind of this acceptance that wasn't even necessarily cognitive. It was more like, you're showing up, you're my niece, and that's my niece's child, and it's all whatever it is. But anyway, yeah, we didn't have to deal with the grandparent situation, but I know a lot who do. It can be difficult. So there are many stories out there in that regard.
Deb, did you get any advice, or do you have any advice for parents of a trans child? Something that you...
Absolutely. Because, when I first got my news, I knew no one else who had a trans child. I just felt alone that, you somehow go into that tunnel of, this is just mine to deal with. And so about a year and a half in, I did find Greater Boston PFLAG. That was my salvation. Up until that point, I was sworn to secrecy. I couldn't tell anybody, my siblings, anybody I was close with. So I was holding this for myself, just to support my son. PFLAG was the first time I could come amongst a group of people. I was safe to share. I was safe to cry. I was safe to just talk about my confusion and not burden my son with it, because they don't want to be dealing with your emotions when they're trying to work out themselves. So I would say find support, and PFLAG is, for me, it's one of the things that kind of saved my life. And I've been a member ever since. And obviously now I do speaker engagements and other things with them. But yeah, just, the reading, and there's stuff online, but for sure having a community of people who are going through the same thing is huge. It really is.
Great, thank you. And I think that's actually a great way to end the evening. A nice shout out to PFLAG and the work that the organization does. And I want to thank you both again for joining us tonight. And thank you all for tuning in. And I'm going to end this. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, everyone.
And we are